This recording will cover Chapter 8 in your textbook, Assessing and Teaching Reading, Fluency, and Comprehension. So, of course, there are a number of learning outcomes, as we have seen in our earlier chapters. So those are the learning outcomes for this chapter. This one covers a lot, in terms of fluency and comprehension. Two pretty big ideas, of course, as we are talking about reading. Thinking about the Common Core state standards, which, we know South Carolina isn't currently using them necessarily, but this is from the publisher and it was copyright in 2021. So other states still are using these. But there are essential literacy skills that students should develop at each grade level, and you can see that in figure 8-1 in your textbook that kind of breaks down grades K through 12. And guidelines for teaching students with learning or behavior problems. You want to look at using increasingly difficult and challenging texts at each grade level, right? So 50% of the selections by grade 4 should all be expository text, okay? And we'll talk about that. Some strands of these standards, key ideas, craft structure, integration of knowledge ideas, range of reading, and level of complexity. And then accommodations and intensive interventions for students with learning disabilities and or behavior disorders. So we will talk about some of those. So we want to, when we're talking about fluency, we want to A, first of all, think about what it means, and B, think about how we are going to assess if your students are fluent. So fluency is the ability to read text at an appropriate rate, accurately, and with expression, right? We don't just want them to read like this because then we don't know what they're saying and then that's really not very engaging, right? We want them to be expressive and have inflection and different voices and whatever else they can do. This one, fluency is the element of reading that is the most readily assessed and monitored, and partly because it's kind of the easiest to do, right? You can just have a student orally read for you and you can see how they do. The goal of fluency is to read with automaticity, okay? Being that, fluent and automatic, not having to stop to think about every single word, so that they will also improve their comprehension. Again, if you have someone who's a very fluent reader, monitoring student progress and reading number of words are correctly per minute, expectation vary by grade level, students read over passages, teacher records errors. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're understanding. We want them to both be automatic and have strong comprehension. So, of course, talking about progress monitoring, I love this, progress monitoring. And the way that this is typically done in reading is the number of words read correctly, orally read correctly per minute, or WCPM. And of course, expectations vary by grade level, and you can see that in your textbook. So you would have the student read an unfamiliar passage or 2 or 3 if you're doing those benchmark assessments that we talked about in chapter 7, kind of 3 times a year. Then they might read like 3 unfamiliar passages and you would take the mean score. If you're doing this more regularly, more weekly, maybe they just read 1 unfamiliar passage. You give them a minute and you see how many words they can read correctly in 1 minute. I'm going to show you what one looks like in just a second. So the formula is the number of words read correctly minus the number of errors equals words read correctly per minute. Okay, I always want to say a different acronym there. So let me just show you. Again, this is from, if the slides look like this, they are from the old edition, but there are a couple things, sometimes it's just worded a little bit differently, so I thought I would put this one up there too. So again, monitoring student progress and fluency pretty much says the same thing. Words read correctly per minute. And for students with fluency problems, the goal is to usually add 1 or 2 more words read correctly per minute, with fluency increasing more quickly in the early grades. All right, so let me show you. This is from DIBELS. Remember, we talked about that in chapter 7, those dynamic indicators of basic early literacy skills. So this is DIBELS. This is a sample progress monitoring probe. So this would be, if you're doing progress monitoring, if you're assessing their progress maybe once a week, you would use something like this. You could start at probe number 1 and just work your way up. So you would tell them, I'm going to give you a minute. When I say begin, I want you to start here and read, all the words that you can until I tell you to stop, or something like that. So they would read, what is big and dangerous and has only 1 eye? The answer is a hairy. Nope, that's wrong. So if they get a word incorrect, you would draw a slash through it. They get it right, you would keep going. You draw your, okay, so we're just gonna remember they got this hurricane wrong, right? Hurricanes are large, strong storms. They form over warm. Oh, guess what? Your time's up. All right, so you would draw a little slash right there. Okay, so the total number of words to this point is 24. That's what those little numbers mean. All right, so 24 total words, right? And how many words did they miss? One, right? They missed this hurricane. So what would be their word read correctly per minute? It'd be 23 in that case, right? So they got to 24. They had one error, so 24 minus 1 is 23. And here is the formula used to calculate fluency and even a sample for you, okay? So just keep this in mind when you're thinking about oral reading fluency. And it's pretty easy, you know, you just have them read for a minute. Total number minus the number of errors. All right, so you can use those scores on those progress monitoring measures to establish fluency goals. So you can graph that, right? We talked about the last, in chapter 7, I showed you those graphs from dibbles.uoregon.edu. Have them, or you can graph, or you know, have paraprofessionals, somebody can graph where they are, so then you can go ahead and establish your baseline fluency and then your target growth rates. I'm not going to get into all this growth rates and stuff right now, but we will talk about it. I think it's in the textbook in a little more detail. Okay, so you know, if you have someone keeping that pyramid in mind, right? We've been talking about that pyramid, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 1, the bottom, you'd probably only do, you know, the assessments maybe 3 times a year, like we've talked about, those benchmarks. Then if you have students in tier 2, you might want to do some, who are working on fluency, right? Not if they're working on something else, but if they're working on fluency, you might want to do progress monitoring every 2 to 3 weeks. If you have someone in tier 3, you might want to assess them, you know, every week. So I did want to show you in the textbook on page 223, chapter, 8.2, apply the concept. So it gives you just a little, you know, kind of handy dandy way to use fluency data. So if the student is making steady progress, you would want to continue in the same level of text, right? They're doing fine, they're progressing upward. So let me think. Oh, yeah, so here's a little graph charting oral reading fluency. Here's the date and here's the number of words read correctly per minute. Okay, so you could do something like that, especially if your students are not making progress. You can show the graph of them not making progress, and that's really valuable and beneficial to show the parents. Okay, so then what if the data shows that the student meets goals on first reading? Well, guess what? Then you want to go to a higher level of text or raise the goal. All right, so you want to make it more challenging for them, right? You don't want them to just be where they are. You want to keep pushing them. But then if the student has difficulty achieving goals, you want to either alter your fluency instruction or move to lower level text. Here is where I disagree. I have always been taught that you do not lower the goal. I know this is what your textbook says, and I know this is probably more realistic than not lowering your fluency goal, but I was always taught don't lower the goal, but instead alter your instruction, maybe move them to tier 2 or maybe move them to tier 3 or move to a lower level text. So this is kind of potato, you know, as you're getting out to schools, ask, you know, if you're, especially if you're working with some classroom teachers, ask them what they do. Do you lower the goal or do you lower the text? So just check out this page 223 because it talks a lot about RTI or, you know, MTS squared, right? We haven't talked about that in a few chapters, but this gives you some good examples of kind of tier 2 intervention. All right, so keep that in mind. Let me get back to the PowerPoint. And don't tell if again, if one of your reading professors says to lower the goal, you listen to what they say. Don't listen to what I say. I'm a math person. No, just kidding. So some strategies for teaching fluency, you know, read aloud, preview books, listen and watch others read aloud. So this is where you could model, right? Model being a really fluent reader with expression and all those other things. Repeated reading, where they could reread the same passage 3 to 5 times. Choral repeated reading, support summer reading, you know, with guidance from postcards or something like that that you would send home. And then peer supported reading to increase quantity of reading for students with learning and behavior problems. And check out those figures and tables in the apply textbook sections in your textbook. There's something that I used with math called peer assisted learning strategies, or PALS, and that's something that you might want to look into as well. So also you want to think about scaffolding sustained silent reading, but then you would need to confer a little after silent reading to check for understanding. So you want to, again, read aloud for fluency. You might give them some comprehension question. Okay, you might do a reader's theater, stuff like that. Students perform a play by reading it aloud to an audience. And then some fluency building programs for students with reading difficulties, let's say tier 2, for example, maybe 15 to 25 minutes of reading 3 times per week. And then methods of teaching comprehension may also be necessary. So that would be typically, tier 2, maybe even tier 3. And again, that's in your textbook figure 8.5. So helping families, how can we help families to improve their children's reading fluency? Well, establish reading time each evening, or you could suggest this to the families. Hey, why don't you read every night, before the child goes to bed? Talk about the library, right? The local library. Talk about getting a library card. The school libraries, allowing your students to check out books that then they can read with their families at home. Encourage parents to share, discuss what they're reading, ask children questions about what they are reading, and discuss different types of print materials, recipes, newspapers. All these things are going to get kids interested in reading. And if you talk about what you're reading, they're going to be super interested because, especially little kids, they all want to be like their teacher, right? So use that to your advantage. All right, so let's talk about a few more minutes in part 1. Let's talk about assessing comprehension and monitoring progress in comprehension. So we kind of talked about fluency. Now we're going to talk about comprehension, and they really need to go hand in hand, right? Fluency and automaticity along with comprehension. So you can question your students. You can carefully choose among comprehension tests. Think about what information you want to get from them. And also, fluency is a really strong predictor of comprehension for early readers. So your students who struggle with fluency, chances are they're going to struggle with comprehension. Not always, of course, because you can have some who are really disfluent readers, but they might understand what they're reading. But typically, fluency is a pretty good predictor, okay? You can ask the students just to simply retell the story. And some versions of Dibbles, let me show you this. Over here is the retell. So you could have the student, I never did the retell with my students, but you could, right? You could say, okay, now tell me everything that you remember. I don't remember the exact direction, so don't quote me on these. Tell me everything you remember from the story, and then they would have to go through and tell you what they remembered. But you can also find that on that uoregon.edu page. So like I said, I never did the retell. I'll show you what I did in just a second. Okay, so, and then you want to determine their response to intervention, of course, by tracking their comprehension, and you could use measures such as the Maze test, and I'm going to show you one in 1 second, and you can also go to rti4success.org. So here is what a Maze test that I used to use looked like. And I think it was 3 minutes. Again, don't quote me on that because it's been a couple years since I have administered these. So you could do, you don't have to administer this one individually. Like oral reading, they have to read individually, right? So you can tell how they're doing if you're, monitoring their progress. But for something like this, for comprehension, you can give this sheet to your whole class if you want. And they would read it. Cam was a clam. They would read it to themselves. He lived in the shallow waters 1/4 of the sea with his parents. So what they would do is choose the word that best fits that sentence. And they could draw a circle around it. I used to give the sheets like this or assessments like this in those clear sheet protectors, and then students could just use dry erase markers or vis-a-vis or whatever they're called and circle their answer. And it's environmentally friendly. So Cam, Shiny was many friends. And again, you would teach them how to take this test because some students might say, I don't know what I'm doing. So you would, give them a little example and say, okay, you're going to see 3 words, and then I want you to circle the word that is correct. I've also seen it where instead of having the words like this in parentheses, I'll use this instead. It would be a blank line, and then underneath the line, it would say Shiny was. And the same thing, they would circle the word, or they could even write the word on the line. So that is one example of this Maze test, M-A-Z-E, that is really helpful for assessing and monitoring their comprehension. All right, so I'm going to stop here to about teaching comprehension, and I will talk about this in part 2, so come on back.